Support for PhillyCentric comes from Squarespace. Squarespace, for credit card processing on phone and mobile devices. Visit www.squarespace.com/PhillyCentric for a special code providing special offers. PhD and Pearl Productions, this is PhillyCentric. One story, told a week at a time. Philadelphia Execution. A true story of murder and American justice by Dave Emmy. Episode 2, The Trial Characters. After a long day, comprised primarily of sitting around and waiting in stuffy rooms, I headed home, catching the end of rush hour traffic. I was instructed to report to the jury room by 9:15 a.m. the following morning. I had put in a full day and had accomplished nothing regarding my own projects and personal responsibilities. I didn't want the day to be nothing more than a donation to the county of Delaware, so I got in an hour of exercise and worked on my music recording until about midnight. I awoke the next day, went through pretty much the same routine, parked in the same parking garage adjacent to the courthouse, went up the courthouse steps, through the metal detectors, and up to the jury room on the second floor across the hall from the courtroom where the trial would take place. Even though it was only my second day at the courthouse, it had begun to feel a bit more familiar, and I found myself beginning to establish a routine. Once in the jury room, we 14 strangers all sat around a long conference table. There wasn't enough room at the table to sit all of us comfortably, so a few of us sat on chairs against the room walls. There was enough space in the room for someone to walk around the conference table while others were seated there, but not much more space than that. A coat rack was located at the front of the room, and behind it was one of two bathrooms that straddled the doorway entrance to the room. The room was painted in a pale antique yellow shade, and there were scuff marks on the lower portions of the wall, likely made by the shoes of prior jurors. The case was delayed for about an hour before we were escorted into the courtroom jury box. Preliminary motions were being argued, and the jury was not privy to hearing these. We made small talk in the jury room, and I was not particularly engaging to the others. I wasn't cold or detached, but I wasn't warm and engaging either. I exchanged some pleasantries with a couple of the jurors seated next to me, and I also read the Philadelphia Inquirer that I had picked up on the way into the courthouse. The lead story of the day was the indictment of Martha Stewart. I made a comment to one of the jurors about how the late-night comedians were going to have a field day with jokes contrasting the image of Martha Stewart's domestic bliss with that of a jail cell. I thought about the possibility of the case being settled through plea bargaining. We weren't allowed to discuss the case with fellow jurors, so I made no comment about this possibility. It's not uncommon for cases to be pleaded out in the last minutes before a trial. Sometimes prosecutors and defense attorneys are engaged in a game of chicken before a trial, trying to see if the other side will blink and offer concessions before entering the risks of a trial where any outcome is possible. At about 10:15 a.m., a court employee came into the room and asked if we were ready to go into the courtroom. The case was not going to be pleaded out. We were then led into the jury box. I was seated at the center of the elevated front row. There were 6 of us in the front row and 6 of us in the back row. the back row being one step higher than the front. The two alternate jurors were seated in front of the jury box on the floor of the courtroom between the prosecutor's table and the witness stand. When a witness was called to the stand, the alternate jurors had to pull their legs beneath their chairs so the witnesses would not trip over them while walking up into the witness box. The chairs in the jury box were reproductions from the colonial period. They were large and wooden with plush hunter green seat and back cushions. The arms of the chairs extended outward at 45-degree angles, allowing more comfort room for the person seated in the chair. The arms of the adjacent chairs were rammed up against each other because the room in the jury box did not allow for a comfortable distance between chairs. When these specific jury chairs were selected, it was obvious that the size of the jury box was not adequately considered. The issue mattered during the trial, particularly when some of the testimony was tedious and required keen attention to stay focused. Often during these times, the juror to my right would twitch his leg in a nervous, restless fashion. Due to the adjacent chair arms being pressed against one another, his movements also rocked my chair and disrupted my concentration. On a couple of occasions, I was on the verge of asking him to stop twitching, but he refrained from it just prior to my asking. I found myself noticing more about people, places, and things than I had before. It was as if my senses had become heightened, but at the same time, so too had my sense of diplomacy. This was a criminal case. First-degree murder. The defendant was a juvenile, only 17 years of age at the time of the killing. The crime was committed almost 2 years earlier. Therefore, at the time of the trial, the defendant was 19 years old. The primary cast of courtroom characters were Judge Robert Brown, Prosecutor Tanya Greer, and defense attorney Daniel Galvin. The defendant's name was Bryant Childs. Prosecutor Greer was an assistant district attorney. I would estimate she was in her early 30s. She was a very attractive, meticulously dressed and groomed, fair-skinned black woman. She was probably about 5 feet 7 inches tall, but in heels maybe closer to 5'10". Each day she wore her hair tightly pulled back in a bun. She had stylish, rimless glasses, and the lenses were kept impeccably clean and clear. She wore very conservative business suits and always kept a serious, stern demeanor. I don't recollect her smiling once. She wasn't angry, but rather serious, stern, determined, and all business. She didn't strike me as having extensive experience at her job, but this was by no means her first case either. She was alone at her table for 2 out of the 4 days of the trial. On the 3rd and 4th day, she was joined by the detective on the case, Detective Slotnick. Greer was very competent, and in my opinion, the district attorney's office was fortunate to have her services. At times she misspoke and occasionally confused things like the sequence of digits in a telephone number, but nothing beyond what any person might do under the same circumstance. She had the beauty, grace, and dignity of a Diane Carroll, a skin tone similar to Halle Berry, and a controlled, steely resolve reminiscent of Demi Moore. She was single, but appeared to be wearing an engagement ring. As a legal adversary, I would say she was very competent, but not intimidating and not totally beyond reproach. Defense attorney Galvin was maybe 10 years older than Prosecutor Greer. He was more experienced and was also meticulously groomed. He was a fair-skinned redhead, maybe of Irish or Scottish descent. He had a burly mustache and had touches of gray in his head and facial hair. He was about 5 feet 10 inches tall and married. He was also very controlled and never lost his temper throughout the trial, although he made frequent objections. There wasn't a prosecution witness who was not subjected to multiple objections by defense counsel. He did his best to protect his client from incriminating evidence, and when such evidence was introduced, he did all he could to undermine its credibility. Whereas Mrs. Greer always sat straight up in her chair, Mr. Galvin often slouched, displaying a casual demeanor. He would also twitch his foot frequently when crossing his legs while being seated. When standing to object to specific testimony, he had the habit of playing with the front button of his suit jacket, which was unbuttoned while he sat. It was a nervous habit, and knowing that he was going to be sitting back down, he usually just toyed with the button rather than buttoning it. Playing with this button, which was around the area of his front pant, each time he forwarded an objection, had a distracting quality. It put in my mind that the passion behind some of his objections may have been somewhat disingenuous. Judge Brown was a black male in his late 50s or early 60s. He was balding on top, but had a gray wrap-around hairline that flowed into a streaming graying beard. Often throughout the trial, he would make faces indicating that he was in intensive thought. His forehead would crumple up, and he'd rub his head and beard with his hand while taking notes. On occasion, his lips would move as if he was verbalizing his thoughts. When he gave us jury instructions, he read from a prepared text in a black 3-ring binder. When reading from this binder, he would turn on a black gooseneck desk lamp with a horizontal fluorescent bulb that was positioned just a few inches above the binder. His interjections in the trial were primarily for clarity's sake. At times he was stern with attorneys, but more often than not, he heard their objections at sidebar conferences. I think outside of the courthouse, he is probably a gentle, mild-mannered, wise man. In the courtroom, with his game face on, his age and demeanor projected authority, but he was willing to hear objections to the proceedings. He was perched high above all others in the courtroom, facing the attorneys. He sat in a large black leather, heavily cushioned, armless swivel chair lined with brass rivets. His bench extended almost the entire width of the courtroom. At the near end of his bench was the witness stand, followed by the doorway where the jury would enter and exit. On the far side of the bench was another doorway that led to the judge's chambers. This end of the bench was where the frequent sidebar arguments were heard by the judge. At the end of the trial, when the judge entered the jury room, we were all surprised at his small stature. In the courtroom, he looked to be at least 6 feet tall and had a commanding presence. Standing next to him, he appeared to be about 5 feet 8 inches tall and had a humble, modest aura. Although he looked nothing like Morgan Freeman, he projected an air of reserved, experienced wisdom through the eyes of a minority, a role often portrayed by that actor. The defendant, Bryant Childs, looked cold and detached throughout the trial. He rarely spoke with his counsel, maybe 3 or 4 times for brief moments throughout the entire case. This lack of communication with his attorney gave me a sense of his detachment to the proceedings. If I were being falsely accused of first-degree murder, I think I would be very engaged with my legal representation. Then again, Bryant Childs had just entered adulthood, and maybe he didn't know how to act in this new, threatening, unfamiliar environment. He didn't show much emotion. He was a 19-year-old black male and was about 5 feet 10 inches tall. He weighed probably around 230 pounds and carried most of that weight in his waist and buttocks. He had a pudgy face, almost like he hadn't quite grown out of his baby fat. His eyes were narrow slits, and they had a beaded and piercing quality somewhat reminiscent of a shark's eyes. He never smiled, frowned, laughed, or cried throughout the entire trial. He was just cold and expressionless. He never confirmed the presence of his family seated behind him midway in the courtroom spectator pews. When walking in and out of the courtroom, his walk still had the frumpy gait of an adolescent youth. Defense attorney Galvin's opening arguments were direct, controlled, and smooth. He spoke about how he was honored to defend a respectable youth like Bryant Childs. He talked about how there was a significant doubt in the prosecutor's case, how Bryant Childs and Stephen Smith were friends, and the fondness that they shared between them. He discussed how he would evidence a solid alibi for Bryant's whereabouts at the time of the murder, and how Bryant would go to the crime scene upon hearing about the slaying of his close friend. One witness would testify on how he saw Bryant crying, head in hands, while sitting across the street from the murder scene. Prosecutor Greer started her opening arguments by rising from her table and walking briskly, circling the table to face us jurors. She was leggy, tall, attractive, stern, and commanded immediate attention. She pointed to a flip chart where the words deliberate, premeditated, and malice were written. She repeated those words twice in a stern tone. She continued by saying, "That was how Bryant Childs took Stephen Smith's life, deliberately, premeditatedly, and with malice." Defense attorney Galvin immediately objected, and the judge heard sidebar arguments from each lawyer. While sidebar arguments were occurring, a loudspeaker was turned on that emanated white noise, thereby disallowing the jury to hear the judge and attorney's conversations. I can only speculate what Galvin was arguing, but I imagine it was about inflammatory, pejorative language on the part of Prosecutor Greer. When Ms. Greer returned from the sidebar, she was somewhat less inciting, but still passionate about what she had to say. Her tone had a mixture of genuine emotional outrage at the brutality of the crime, combined with conveying statements that she had previously constructed and rehearsed, with some nervousness mixed in. Maybe I was taken by her attractive appearance, but I admired her efforts. She was there, alone, doing the best she could in an emotionally charged environment, and she was getting the job done. She probably had the full spectrum of feelings running through her, all without any visible means of support. She must have felt outrage at the crime, pressure to put on a solid case for the Commonwealth, always with an eye on what defense counsel would object to, while simultaneously contemplating all other matters associated with trying the case. In addition, she was black, prosecuting a young black defendant in front of an all-white jury. I can only speculate on the ethnic incongruities she must have felt, but I suspect these feelings existed in some manner. She was very professional and never visually displayed any of this sentiment. When she continued her opening remarks, she talked about how she would produce 2 eyewitnesses to the crime, both identifying Bryant Childs as the killer of Stephen Smith. She talked about a phone call made by Bryant Childs attempting to intimidate a witness that would corroborate his guilt. She was most animated during opening and closing arguments, but there was an ever-so-slight suggestion of a practiced and rehearsed presentation in some of her voice inflections and occasional vigorous gestures. After the first 2 prosecution witnesses, we broke for a late lunch. It was drizzling that afternoon, and I had to go out to an automated bank money machine. I found one a couple of blocks from the courthouse and saw that a small lunch eatery specializing in salads was across the street. Those who wore a juror button were entitled to a 10% discount. It was close and it was raining, so I ate lunch there, alone.
Media is a quaint little town, and being the county legislative seat, there are many legally related businesses there. It has managed to retain its American colonial character, and it looks like a small bedroom community that you would find in the New England countryside. Many of the houses were constructed in the 1700s and 1800s. Some are two-storey brick row homes with bright white window shutters and 3 steps originating from the cobblestone sidewalk leading to the front door, complete with the eye-level bright brass knob. The historic regions of Boston, Philadelphia and New York all have similar structures. Many of these row homes have been converted into law offices. Assemblymen and various other government employees comprise many of the town residents. There are also houses from the late 1800s with wraparound porches and a modest amount of property behind white picket fences, nestled in pockets throughout the town. There are a couple of churches in town complete with steeples about 5 stories high. Pennsylvania has a rich history of adverse political strife, and some of it played out right here in Delaware County. In 1701, William Penn issued a charter of privileges for all his commonwealth. This charter guaranteed religious freedom to all and welcomed religious and racial diversity to the region. These privileges were often in opposition to those instituted in England, the Commonwealth's fatherland. At the time of the American Revolution, many British expatriates called Tories remained loyal to the British Crown. These people were in conflict with the Whigs and rebels who wished to establish a new country free from British oppression and taxation. When the Civil War broke out, many residents of the area gathered in Media to join the Union Bluecoats. Rumors were running wild that the city of Washington might be invaded by Confederate rebels. Troops were quickly organized in Media and sent south under the command of General Irwin McDowell. At the same time, many Southern sympathizers, called Copperheads, lived in the area. They felt that blacks who were freed would move north and take many of the labor-intensive jobs that fueled the Industrial Revolution. These jobs were being held by immigrants like the Irish and German, and they feared that blacks might take their livelihoods. The American Revolution, economic conflicts, racial strife, the Civil War and Industrial Revolution, and many other struggles that helped forge America into what it has become today, with all its good and bad, were played out in the history of Delaware County. Some of these same polarizing attitudes inherent to those conflicts would become apparent during the course of this trial.
On Thursday morning, the prosecution called their last witness and rested their case. When Ms. Greer said, "The prosecution now rests," the juror to my right said, "Interesting." I think we were all surprised at the brevity of the prosecution's case. We broke for lunch, and that afternoon we were to hear the start of the defense case. It was a nice day that afternoon, for a change. It had been raining in biblical proportions in the Northeast that spring, so I wanted to take advantage of finally seeing the sun. While strolling through town, I came across one of the fellow jurors named Jim. He was about 6 feet 5 inches tall, somewhat lanky. I'd estimate about 45 years old, with salt and pepper graying hair. He seemed like a nice guy, and we spent some time walking through town together, making small talk. We approached the eatery where I had a salad a couple of days earlier, and we went in and had lunch there. He was a college basketball fan, as I once was, and with Temple, Penn, Villanova, LaSalle, St. Joe's, and Drexel all in Philadelphia, we had plenty to talk about. When we returned to the courtroom, the defense presented their case. They only had 3 witnesses, and all of them testified that afternoon. The defense then rested. The prosecution had no rebuttal witnesses, so we were told that we would be presented with closing arguments on Friday morning. The trial was fast. It only took 4 days of witness testimony, introduction of other evidence, ballistics, autopsy photos, etc., and opening and closing arguments. On Friday morning of the same week that I was selected as a juror, we were presented with closing arguments. Although the trial went relatively quickly, each day was a long one. We were to be at the courthouse by 9:15 a.m., and we left at approximately 6 p.m. on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Both the prosecutor and defense attorney were passionate and aggressive. There were many sidebars throughout the trial, and the jury was often asked to leave the courtroom for various motions and arguments. For each day of the trial, I would say we came in and out of the courtroom 4 to 6 times. Although I felt each attorney was very competent and did a good job, I felt the judge allowed them a bit too much leniency. Most objections were followed by a sidebar. The judge rarely sustained or overruled objections from his bench. Knowing that the judge would thoroughly consider each objection, the attorneys objected liberally. In retrospect, I think the judge wanted to give the defendant every benefit of the doubt and allowed for as much of a zealous defense as possible. Considering the nature of the crime and the age of the defendant, upon reflection, it probably was a wise course of action. That being said, as a juror, the repeated breaks in the trial due to sidebars and having to go in and out of the courtroom numerous times each day contributed to making each day a long one and made the trial and witness testimony somewhat disjointed and harder to fully absorb. Throughout the trial proceedings, the jurors were not allowed to discuss the case, and we all took notice not to engage in that type of conversation. Many times when we were asked to leave the courtroom to go back to the jury room, not a word was said in the jury room. One day the trial proceedings appeared in the newspaper, and one juror brought the newspaper in, but warned everyone not to turn to the page where the article on the trial appeared. It was difficult not to talk about the astonishing things that were displayed to us. Chilling testimony, autopsy photos, ballistics, it all was very gripping and emotional. The murder occurred on Sunday morning, October 7th, in the city of Chester. Chester is located in Delaware County, which borders on the city of Philadelphia. All jurors were residents of Delaware County, but none of us resided in Chester. The victim's name was Stephen Smith, and he was a 19-year-old black male. The crime occurred sometime between 2 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. Sunday morning. The victim was shot twice in the head at point-blank range.
Chester, Pennsylvania is not unlike many forgotten impoverished towns scattered throughout America. Camden, New Jersey, Gary, Indiana, Benton Harbor, Michigan, and many others that are all similar places. Crime is frequent, unemployment is high, urban blight is prevalent, and residents are primarily black. The town was once a prosperous manufacturing center, but 40 or 50 years ago the primary manufacturing companies shut down and left. The town's economic prosperity disappeared, while the residential housing remained but steadily declined. No further investment was made in the area, and crime and drugs took root. In some ways, Chester is a microcosm of Philadelphia. At one time, Philadelphia was the capital of the United States. To appease southern states, the capital of the country was moved to Washington, D.C. in the early 1800s. And all the economic benefits from federal employment went along with it. Still, Philadelphia was a prominent destination for European immigrants, so it remained a vibrant city. Then, from the mid-1800s through the early 1900s, New York became the primary port of entry for European immigration, and again Philadelphia lost the prominence it once held. Although once times and generations have long since passed, in parts of Philadelphia you can still sense that passed over Stepson kind of feeling amongst the native residents. First Washington took the city's soul, then New York took what was left of it. There are preserved historic regions of Philadelphia called Old City and Independence Mall, but there is also much urban blight and decay. Many manufacturing jobs have left the region, and the city's population has steadily decreased over the last few decades. More people now leave the city to work in the suburbs than leave the suburbs to work in the city. In William Penn's lifetime, Chester was the primary settlement of the Delaware River in the Commonwealth. It was the government seat, a trading hub, economically prosperous, and a destination for many European trading vessels and immigrants. Being just 5 miles from the Delaware state line, and due in large part to continual disputes with Lord Baltimore over the precise location of the Commonwealth's southern border, Penn decided to move the capital of his Commonwealth 10 miles north up the Delaware River to Philadelphia rather than Chester. Chester lost its statewide political prominence and clout, but it still remained the Delaware County legislative seat, a trading centre, and still had economic vibrancy and stability. Then in the mid-1800s, the county seat was moved from Chester to Media, and this had an additional detrimental economic impact upon Chester. First Philadelphia took the city's soul, then Media took what was left of it. The economic spiral continued downward when manufacturing jobs left the region following World War II. Crime and urban blight crept in, and the town has never fully recovered.
The jury is introduced, bringing experience, knowledge, wisdom, and personal bias into deliberations.